3 words destroyed my marriage before breakfast. At 6:17 a.m., my phone buzzed against the nightstand hard enough to rattle the lamp, and I remember staring at the ceiling for a full 5 seconds before I reached for it, because something in my gut already knew that whatever waited on that screen was going to rearrange my life. The message wasn't from a client, not from family, not from some spam notification I could swipe away and forget. It was from my wife's best friend, and the preview showed a video file with a caption that simply read, "You deserve to know." I wish I could tell you I opened it immediately, but I didn't. I sat there with my thumb hovering, feeling the weight of those 4 words pressing into my chest. I should have ignored it. I should have confronted her first. I should have prepared myself. Instead, I pressed play. The first 2 seconds were blurry and shaky, like someone adjusting their grip on the phone. Then the frame steadied, and I saw my wife sitting on the edge of a hotel bed in a silk blouse I'd bought her for our anniversary, her hair falling over one shoulder the way it does when she's relaxed, when she's laughing. She was laughing in the video. Not nervous laughter, not awkward. It was warm and low and intimate, the kind of laugh she used to reserve for me when the lights were off and the world was small and just ours. And she wasn't alone. He stepped into frame, shirt half buttoned, leaning down toward her with a familiarity that made my stomach twist. I recognized him instantly. Not just anyone. Her business partner. The man who had toasted at our last dinner party and told me how lucky he was to work beside someone as brilliant and loyal as my wife. I almost laughed, because she had no idea I knew, because at that exact moment she was asleep beside me, breathing softly, one arm draped across my waist as if nothing in the world had shifted. I replayed the video 3 times, not because I doubted what I was seeing, but because I needed to study it. The timestamp in the corner, the reflection in the mirror behind them, the hotel logo etched into the glass of a framed print on the wall. I let the shock settle into something colder. That's when everything shifted. Rage would have been easier. Rage burns hot and fast. What I felt instead was something slow and deliberate, something that whispered instead of screamed. The worst part wasn't the cheating. It was how comfortable they looked. She tilted her head back when he touched her waist, and the look on her face wasn't guilt or hesitation. It was hunger. I felt it in my chest like a punch, that familiar heat of attraction twisted into something ugly. I remembered that blouse against my hands. I remembered the way she would lean into me in crowded rooms. I remembered believing that I was the only one who knew that version of her. Silence is powerful. So I didn't wake her up. I didn't throw the phone at the wall. I didn't demand answers. Instead, I locked the screen, set it down carefully, and stared at the ceiling again while my mind started connecting dots I hadn't wanted to see before. The late strategy meetings, the sudden interest in solo travel for conferences she used to hate attending alone, the way she had become distant in small, almost invisible ways, like she was already halfway somewhere else. How long has this been going on? And why would her best friend betray her now? Those questions circled in my head like vultures. I opened the video again and turned the brightness up. I started watching details instead of faces. On the desk behind them was a laptop, open. On the bedside table was a stack of printed documents. There was a half-empty champagne bottle with 2 glasses, one smudged with lipstick I recognized instantly. I started building a timeline in my head without even realizing I was doing it. Patience is louder than rage. She stirred beside me and mumbled something about needing to get ready early for a conference call, her voice thick with sleep, and I felt something inside me go completely still. She rolled onto her back and stretched, the blanket slipping just enough to remind me of how much I had wanted her only hours earlier. The attraction didn't vanish just because I'd seen the video. That was the worst part. I still wanted her. I still knew the shape of her body in the dark, and she was lying there like we were fine. "I might be home late tonight," she murmured without opening her eyes, and I watched her mouth form the lie so easily that I felt a strange, detached clarity settle over me. I let her keep talking. I let her outline her day, the client meetings, the budget reviews with her partner, the casual mention of drinks afterward because they had a lot to celebrate. That's when I understood something dangerous. If I reacted now, if I exploded, I would lose whatever advantage I had. She thought she was safe. She thought I was asleep in more ways than one. I wasn't. I picked up the phone again after she went into the shower and rewatched the video with the sound low, studying every inch of the background. That's when I noticed something in the corner that neither of them realized was being recorded. In the reflection of the laptop screen, there was a spreadsheet open, and even through the blur I could see columns labeled with the name of their company and numbers that didn't match what she'd told me about their latest quarterly results. I paused the video and zoomed in until the image pixelated, my heart beating not from heartbreak now, but from something sharper. Because that wasn't just an affair, that was something else entirely. And whatever it was, they had just handed it to me on a silver platter. She came out of the shower with steam clinging to her skin and that same practiced calm she always wore like armor. And while she wrapped her hair in a towel, she started talking about the conference, as if the word itself could sanitize everything it touched, as if repeating it often enough would make it real enough to fool the universe. And I sat at the edge of the bed pretending to scroll through emails while my thumb hovered over that paused frame in my head, the one where her laughter looked too easy and his hand looked too familiar. When she leaned down to kiss the top of my head, I almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because I could feel the distance between what she thought I was and what I had already become. And the air in the room tasted different, metallic and sharp, like my body had decided to stop believing in comfort. "You're up early," she said, soft and affectionate, and I watched her face carefully because she had no idea I knew. And in that ignorance she looked almost radiant, which made the unfairness of it sting even more because betrayal shouldn't get to look beautiful. "I've got that call with Victor at 8, she added, and she said his name too casually, like it was nothing, like it didn't belong to a man who had just been in a hotel room with her. And the worst part wasn't the cheating. It was how naturally she folded it into our life like an extra ingredient, like something she could stir in without changing the flavor. At the kitchen table, she moved through the morning with the confidence of someone who believed she was invisible, pouring coffee, sliding a plate toward me, talking about venue lighting and panel discussions and how exhausting it was to network for hours. And I let her keep talking because every sentence she offered was another thread I could pull later. "They moved the meeting location last minute," she said, stirring sugar into her cup with a tiny clink that sounded too loud in my ears, and I nodded like a man who trusted his wife, like a man who didn't know that the hotel logo reflected in that video was the same brand as the one near their office. "It's annoying," she went on, "but the client's worth it, and Victor thinks if we play it right, we'll lock them in for another year." She said it with pride, with that spark she gets when she talks business, and it stirred something complicated in me, because that ambition was part of what I'd always been drawn to, that electricity of competence, that sense that she could walk into a room and bend it around her. Attraction doesn't turn off like a light switch, even when your heart is trying to protect itself. And there was a sick kind of tension in watching her smile at me across the table, while my mind replayed her smile at him. Two versions of the same expression, one meant for home and one meant for secrecy. "You look tired," she said, reaching across to squeeze my hand, and her fingers were warm, familiar, and I felt the urge to yank away fight with the urge to hold on tighter just to prove I still could. I asked questions the way you handle a glass you don't trust, carefully, without letting your grip show. "So the conference is fully out of town," I said, keeping my voice casual. "Or is it one of those local hotel setups where everyone pretends they're traveling because it feels more important that way?" She laughed, light and easy, and her laugh was a blade because it sounded exactly like the laugh in the video. "It's local," she admitted too quickly, and then she corrected herself with a little shrug that was meant to look effortless. "Well, kind of local. It's just easier to stay overnight because the schedule is packed and traffic is horrible, and you know how these things go." I watched her eyes flick to my face, searching for suspicion, and I gave her none, because patience is louder than rage, and because I wanted to see how far she'd go. "That makes sense," I said. Then I tilted my head like I was thinking about something else entirely. "Speaking of schedules, Did you ever figure out why the investment account notification came through last week? The one about allocation changes? Because I couldn't tell if it was a routine update or if something actually shifted. Her spoon paused for a fraction of a second, just a fraction, but it was enough to make my skin tighten. And then she smiled again. Too smooth, too ready. "Oh, that," she said, and her voice turned breezy in a way that felt rehearsed. "It was nothing, just the advisor rebalancing things. You know how they do it. It's all automated and boring." She sipped her coffee, and I could see her throat move, and for the first time I wondered if she was swallowing more than caffeine. I didn't push, not yet, but the open loop tightened around my thoughts like a wire, because that slip, that tiny pause, told me the affair wasn't the only betrayal, and I felt something dark settle behind my ribs as I realized I might not just be competing with a man, I might be competing with a plan. When she left for the day, she hugged me longer than usual, and I couldn't tell if it was guilt or camouflage, and she whispered, "Tonight might run late, so don't wait up," with that same tender tone people use when they want you to feel safe. "Of course," I said, and I meant it in a way she couldn't possibly understand, because I wasn't waiting up for her. I was waiting for the truth to finish revealing itself. The moment the door clicked shut, I pulled my phone out, stared at the thread with her best friend, and typed, "Why now?" Because that question burned almost as much as the video itself, and the reply came fast enough to make my blood run colder. "Because he's not the first," it said, and my stomach dropped so hard I had to grip the counter, because suddenly the story in my head stopped being about one betrayal and started becoming something bigger, something layered and ugly and far more deliberate than I had wanted to believe. She looked terrified when she pulled into the back corner of the cafe parking lot, like someone who had just stepped out onto thin ice and wasn't sure it would hold. And for a second I almost felt sorry for her because whatever she was about to say had clearly been living in her chest for a while. I stayed in my car at first, watching her through the windshield as she checked her mirrors twice and then once more, as if paranoia had become a habit, and when I finally stepped out and walked toward her passenger side door, I realized my hands were steady in a way that surprised me. I wasn't shaking anymore. I wasn't confused. I was calculating. She unlocked the door and I slid into the seat beside her, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and nervous sweat, and for a moment neither of us spoke because the silence itself felt loaded. "You think you're the only one," she said finally, her voice low and strained, and that sentence alone told me this wasn't revenge. This was survival. I studied her face the way I had studied the video, searching for cracks, and I saw them everywhere. Her mascara was slightly smudged, her lips pressed together too tightly, her fingers gripping the steering wheel even though the engine was off. "How long?" I asked, and I didn't raise my voice because calm is more unsettling than anger, and she swallowed before answering. 18 months, she said, and the number hung between us like something toxic, because 18 months isn't a mistake, it isn't a slip, it's a parallel life. I stared straight ahead at the brick wall of the cafe and felt the weight of those months pressing against my ribs, and I could see flashes of birthdays, holidays, random Tuesdays where she had kissed me goodbye and then walked into another version of herself. "I should have told you sooner," her friend continued, and her voice cracked on the word sooner. "But I didn't know how deep it went until recently, and when I realized what they were planning, I couldn't keep pretending I didn't see it." Planning. That word sharpened everything. "Planning what?" I asked, and she hesitated just long enough to confirm that whatever she said next would be worse than what I already knew. "They've been talking about relocating," she admitted, her eyes finally meeting mine. "Not just the business, but themselves, and they've been discussing restructuring assets before they do it." My jaw tightened, even though I forced my expression to stay neutral, because restructuring assets doesn't sound like romance. It sounds like preparation, like someone building an exit that leaves someone else holding the loss. "You're saying she was going to leave," I said slowly, and the words felt foreign in my mouth, because until that moment the affair had been an emotional wound, but now it was becoming something financial, something strategic. She nodded. "They've had conversations about how to make it look clean, how to shift things gradually so it doesn't trigger alarms, and he's been pushing her to move faster. I felt something dark and steady settle into place, because this wasn't chaos, this was choreography. Why tell me now? I asked again, because that question still burned hotter than the rest, and she looked away as if the answer embarrassed her. Because he tried to involve me, she said, and there it was, the unexpected thread that made everything twist. She explained that a few weeks ago he had cornered her after a meeting, lowering his voice and leaning too close, suggesting that if she wanted to secure her own future, she should consider investing quietly in a side venture he was building, something that would benefit from inside knowledge. He thought I'd be flattered, she said bitterly, like I'd jump at the chance to be part of their secret. I watched her hands tremble slightly as she spoke, and I realized she wasn't just disgusted. She was scared, because if he was willing to pull her in, he was willing to widen the circle. Was she in on that? I asked, meaning my wife, and the friend shook her head slowly. I don't know, she admitted, but I know this much. She's planning something bigger than just leaving you, and if you wait, if you don't blow this up right now, you can take back everything. The way she said everything made it sound less like a suggestion and more like a warning, and I felt the shift inside me from wounded husband to something colder, something that understood leverage. I thought about the spreadsheet reflected in the laptop screen, about the slight pause at breakfast when I mentioned the investment account, about how easily she had lied while touching my hand. Does she know that you know? I asked quietly, and for the first time since I'd gotten into the car, her composure cracked completely. She froze. Her eyes widened just enough to tell me I had stepped onto something dangerous, and in that silence I realized there were still layers I hadn't uncovered, still pieces moving beneath the surface, and if she didn't know that her best friend had crossed the line, then I was sitting on a secret that could either protect me or detonate everything before I was ready. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't confront her with shaking hands and a cracked voice the way I might have a year ago when I still believed emotions solved things. Instead, I built a timeline. I sat in my office with the blinds half closed and the video paused on my laptop, and I started matching dates from that hotel stay with credit card statements, calendar entries, and expense reports from the company she co-owned with him. And the more I aligned the pieces, the less this looked like reckless passion, and the more it looked like structure. Patience is louder than rage, and rage would have warned them. Patience let me watch. The first pattern was subtle, almost innocent if you didn't know where to look. Client dinners that lined up perfectly with boutique hotel charges. Late strategy sessions that coincided with room service bills. I zoomed in on the spreadsheet reflected in the laptop from the video, enhancing the image just enough to make out fragments of numbers and column titles, and I felt that same metallic clarity settle over me when I realized those weren't just projections, they were transfers. I started watching everything, not just her schedule, but the company filings, the shared investment notifications, the small adjustments in our joint accounts that she had brushed off as automated rebalancing. One evening I opened the portal while she was in the shower and saw that a significant portion of funds had been shifted into a new holding structure tied to the business, and the date of the change matched a week when she had come home glowing, telling me how aligned she and Victor finally were. I didn't confront her. I consulted someone else first. A quiet attorney recommended by a colleague, the kind of man who speaks softly and listens longer than he talks. And when I laid out the financial irregularities without mentioning the affair, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers as if he had seen this pattern before. If there is commingling of personal and business funds under false pretenses, he said carefully, there are leverage points, especially if there's a clause about ethical conduct in their partnership agreement. That phrase lodged itself in my mind like a key sliding into a lock. Ethical conduct. I went home that night and searched through a scanned copy of their original business contract that she had once proudly shown me, and there it was in plain language. Any behavior that materially harmed the company's reputation or violated fiduciary duty could trigger a forced review of ownership shares. The affair violated it. The financial manipulation violated it even more. Can I trigger the clause without revealing that I know? That question kept me awake more than the betrayal itself. I replayed breakfast in my mind, the way she had smiled across the table, the way she had reached for my hand while lying so effortlessly, and I realized something dangerous. She thought she was ahead. She thought I was still in the dark, still trusting, still slow. That miscalculation was the only advantage I needed. Then I discovered something else that made my pulse steady instead of race. Their largest client, the one she kept mentioning with that mix of pride and hunger, was deeply conservative about public image. Their brand revolved around integrity, transparency, and family values, and they had a renewal meeting scheduled in 3 weeks that would determine whether the company survived another year at its current level. I almost laughed when I saw the date on the calendar, because the timing felt less like coincidence and more like opportunity. That's when everything shifted from personal heartbreak to strategic planning. I started documenting quietly, copying statements, saving correspondence, building a folder that grew thicker by the day. I didn't tell her I knew about the hotel. I didn't mention the video. I kissed her goodnight and asked about her day. And when she described long meetings and exhausting negotiations, I watched her mouth form each lie and stored it away. Attraction still flickered in inconvenient moments, like when she leaned against the counter in one of my old shirts, her hair loose, looking so familiar it almost hurt, and the tension between what I felt physically and what I knew intellectually became its own kind of torment. But torment sharpens you if you let it. By the end of the second week, I had enough to see the outline of what they were doing. Funds were being siphoned subtly, not enough to raise immediate alarms, but enough to create a cushion for relocation, enough to shift leverage if she decided to walk away. And the renewal meeting with that image-obsessed client loomed closer every day, a ticking clock they didn't realize was sinking to mine. 3 weeks, I told myself, staring at the calendar on my wall. 3 weeks until everything they thought was secure could start to unravel. I kissed her goodnight that evening with the same softness I always had. And the strangest part was that none of it felt fake because muscle memory is powerful and desire doesn't evaporate just because trust does. She tasted like the wine we'd shared over dinner, and when her fingers curled into the fabric of my shirt, I felt that familiar pull in my chest, the reminder that before she became my opponent, she had been my favorite person in the room. "You've been distant lately," she murmured against my neck, her voice low and almost vulnerable, and for a split second I wondered if she sensed the shift in me, or if she was just projecting her own guilt. I ran my hand down her back slowly, deliberately, and said, "Work's been heavy, but I'm here." And the double meaning of that sentence almost made me smile because she heard reassurance while I felt resolve. Over the next few days, I leaned in instead of pulling away. I asked about the future. I asked about expansion. I asked what she saw for the company in 5 years, and she lit up in a way that was almost hypnotic, talking about scaling operations, about attracting larger investors, about restructuring to optimize efficiency. She started talking about expansion like it was a shared dream, and I watched the way her eyes shone when she described the freedom it would give us. And I realized she had convinced herself that whatever she was doing was justified because it led somewhere bigger. "If we move some of the capital into a new holding structure," she explained one night while we sat on the couch, her legs draped over mine, "we can protect ourselves from volatility and position the company for acquisition later." She spoke confidently, professionally, as if this was purely strategic, and I nodded thoughtfully, letting her believe I was impressed. She thought she was winning. I let her believe it. Privately, I began shifting my own pieces across the board. I redirected my personal income into an account she couldn't access, citing tax optimization when she casually asked about a notification she saw. I consulted the attorney again and learned exactly how much joint liquidity I could freeze without raising suspicion, framing it as long-term planning for our stability. Everything I did was legal, documented, defensible. Silence is powerful, and paperwork is sharper than anger. Each small adjustment tightened the perimeter around what she thought she could quietly move. Then I set the trap. Our anniversary was 2 weeks away, and she had mentioned more than once how busy she would be around that time because of the client renewal meeting. I leaned into that narrative and told her I wanted to do something meaningful but simple, Just a small gathering with friends and business associates to celebrate both our marriage and the company's growth. A surprise anniversary party, I said casually over breakfast, watching her expression carefully. Something that shows everyone how aligned we are. She laughed and called me sentimental, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes that looked almost relieved, like she believed I was still firmly on her side. I invited her. I invited Victor. I invited the biggest client, framing it as a networking opportunity wrapped in personal celebration. I invited mutual friends who admired our relationship, people who would amplify whatever story unfolded that night. And I invited her best friend, the one who had sent the video, because open loops make people nervous, and I wanted every player in the same room when the air shifted. What am I planning at the party? That question hummed beneath everything I did, and even I didn't allow myself to answer it fully yet, because plans grow stronger when they're allowed to breathe. I just knew the timing mattered. The renewal meeting was scheduled 2 days after the party. Emotions would still be fresh. Impressions would still be forming. 2 days before the event, she stood in the doorway of my office and watched me longer than usual, her arms crossed loosely over her chest, her expression thoughtful in a way that made my pulse slow instead of spike. "Have you been acting strange lately?" she asked carefully, not accusing but searching, and there was a softness in her tone that might have fooled me once. I leaned back in my chair and met her gaze steadily, giving her the same calm she had given me across the breakfast table weeks earlier. "Strange how?" I replied, my voice even, my face open, and for a moment the room felt like a chessboard suspended in midair, both of us aware that something was shifting but neither willing to name it first. I almost confessed right there in my office when she asked if I had been acting strange, because the tension of carrying the secret had started to feel heavier than the betrayal itself, and for a split second I imagined pulling up the video, turning the screen toward her, and watching the color drain from her face. Instead, I held her gaze and let the silence stretch, because silence makes people fill gaps with truth. She stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind her, which was unusual for a casual question, and something in the way her shoulders were set told me this wasn't just suspicion, it was pressure building somewhere else. "Victor's been off lately," she said slowly, choosing her words with more care than I had heard in weeks, and that name landing in my office felt different now, less like an inside joke and more like a fracture. I leaned back in my chair, careful to keep my expression neutral, and asked what she meant, and she exhaled in a way that sounded less like frustration and more like exhaustion. "He's getting desperate," she admitted, rubbing her temple as if a headache had been stalking her all day. "And you don't know him like I do when he feels cornered." That sentence landed harder than I expected, because until that moment, I had framed her entirely as the architect of this mess, the one orchestrating a quiet exit with him. But desperation implies pressure, and pressure implies something unstable. She walked to the window and crossed her arms, staring out as if the answer might be written on the glass. "He wants majority control before the renewal," she continued, her voice dropping, "and he's pushing me to accelerate things I'm not comfortable accelerating." I felt my pulse slow rather than spike, because information is leverage, and she was handing it to me without realizing how closely I was listening. "Accelerate what?" I asked evenly, and she hesitated just long enough for the room to feel smaller. "Restructuring," she said finally, and there was that word again, but this time it didn't sound ambitious. It sounded threatening. She turned to face me, and for the first time in weeks I saw something raw in her expression, something that wasn't polished or controlled. "This started because he backed me into a corner," she said, and my mind caught on the word "started" like a hook. I didn't interrupt. I didn't move. I let her continue. She told me that months ago, during a late audit, he had claimed to find irregularities in the company's books, numbers that could be interpreted as negligence on her part if anyone looked too closely, and he had implied that if the board ever saw them without context, her credibility would be destroyed. "He said he could make it go away," she whispered, and I felt something cold slide down my spine because the story I had been telling myself suddenly shifted shape. "He said if we were aligned personally and professionally, If we presented a united front, there would be no reason for anyone to dig. I stared at her, the confession hanging in the air, and realized the affair hadn't started as passion, at least not on paper. It had started as leverage. She cheated. That part didn't change, but she was also being used. Is she a villain or a pawn? That question hit me with more force than I expected, because anger is easier when the roles are clean. She stepped closer to my desk and lowered her voice. "You don't understand how manipulative he can be," she said, and there was fear in it now, real fear. "And if he thinks I'm pulling back, he'll burn everything." The irony of that sentence almost made me smile, because everything was already burning. She just didn't know I had been watching the flames form. After she left the room, I reopened the financial records with a new lens. I dug deeper into transaction histories, into vendor payments that seemed inflated, into transfers that looped through secondary accounts before landing in places that didn't match official reports. The more I traced the paths, the clearer the pattern became. He wasn't just manipulating her emotionally. He had been siphoning funds gradually, creating discrepancies that could be blamed on her oversight if anyone needed a scapegoat. My chest tightened, not out of sympathy exactly, but out of recognition that the boardroom version of betrayal was even uglier than the hotel room one. Then I rewatched the video again, this time focusing entirely on the laptop behind them. I paused on a frame where the screen reflected clearly in the mirror, and I adjusted the contrast until the numbers sharpened just enough to make sense. What I had first taken as routine projections were actually line items tied to accounts I had just flagged as suspicious. The video wasn't just evidence of cheating, it had accidentally captured proof of embezzlement on a laptop screen behind them, frozen in plain sight while they were too distracted to notice. And in that moment, sitting alone with the glow of the screen lighting up my face, I realized that whatever story she was telling herself about being cornered, I was the only one in this triangle who now held all the angles. Everything changed the night I stopped thinking like a betrayed husband and started thinking like a strategist, because revenge wasn't enough anymore, and heartbreak felt almost irrelevant compared to the leverage sitting quietly on my hard drive. I had the affair, I had the financial discrepancies, I had a partnership clause about ethical conduct that could detonate their entire structure if triggered correctly. Now it was chess, and for the first time since that message buzzed at 6:17 in the morning, I felt steady. I didn't confront her with the video. I didn't even hint at it. Instead, I asked her to sit down with me after dinner 2 nights before the anniversary party, my tone calm enough that she didn't tense immediately. She curled her legs beneath her on the couch, looking tired, vulnerable, and still undeniably attractive in a way that irritated me because desire complicates clarity. I opened my laptop and turned it toward her, not to show the hotel room but to show columns of numbers. "I've been reviewing some financial patterns," I said evenly, watching her expression instead of the screen. "And I think Victor has been siphoning funds in ways that could be traced back to you." Fear replaced defensiveness so fast it almost startled me, and I knew in that second that whatever guilt she carried about the affair, she had not fully grasped how exposed she might be. "What are you talking about?" she asked, leaning forward, her voice no longer polished but sharp and anxious, and I scrolled through transaction histories slowly, explaining how certain transfers looped through secondary vendors before landing in accounts that aligned with his private investment interests. I watched her jaw tighten as recognition dawned, and I could almost see the mental recalculation happening behind her eyes. "He told me those were temporary holds," she said quietly, more to herself than to me, and there it was again, that thin line between accomplice and pawn. "He's stealing from you," I said firmly, letting the weight of that statement settle in the room, and for once I wasn't lying. She pressed her fingers against her lips, thinking, and the silence stretched thick between us. "If this is true," she said carefully, "and it surfaces before the renewal meeting, it could destroy everything." I nodded slowly, letting her sit with the implications. "Unless you get ahead of it," I replied, keeping my tone measured. "Unless you control how and when it surfaces." She looked at me then with something I hadn't seen in weeks, maybe months, and it wasn't love, It was reliance. She needed stability. She needed someone who wasn't manipulating her, and she had no idea that the man sitting beside her had already mapped out the next 3 moves. After she went to bed, I finalized what I had been preparing quietly in the background. I organized the documentation into separate packets, one for the company's board outlining fiduciary breaches, one for the major client detailing inconsistencies that could affect contract integrity, and one for Victor's silent investors who would be deeply interested in learning where their capital had actually traveled. Each email was drafted but unsent, scheduled to release simultaneously at a precise time during the anniversary gathering. I needed them to turn on each other. I needed Victor to see that the person he thought he controlled had become his greatest liability. I rewrote the ending without raising my voice once. The anniversary party invitations had already gone out, framed as a celebration of partnership, loyalty, and shared success. Everyone was coming. The client had confirmed attendance. 2 board members would be there. Victor had even texted me to say he was looking forward to raising a glass to growth, and I stared at that message longer than necessary, imagining his expression when growth turned into exposure. She believed we were protecting the company together. He believed he was still pulling strings. Neither of them realized I was holding the curtain. Then, late the next afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from her best friend, and the simplicity of it made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt since that first video. "He knows something's wrong," it read, and in those 4 words I heard urgency, risk, and the possibility that the board might shift before I was ready to move the queen. Everyone was smiling. That was the first thing I noticed as the room filled with soft music and polite laughter, as glasses clinked and compliments floated through the air like nothing in the world was about to fracture. No one knew. They moved through the space admiring the catered spread, congratulating my wife on another successful year, shaking Victor's hand with admiration, and I watched it all from the center of the room like a man standing inside a secret. She looked nervous in a way only I could detect, a slight tightness around her eyes, a carefulness in how often she checked her phone, but to everyone else she looked radiant, dressed in a fitted navy dress that made more than one guest glance twice. He walked in confident, carrying a bottle of champagne like he owned the future, clapping me on the shoulder and saying, "You really outdid yourself with this one." And I smiled back with a steadiness that surprised even me. I raised a glass once most of the key players had arrived, waiting until the major client stood near the center, until 2 board members were within earshot, until the best friend hovered just close enough to feel the shift before anyone else. "I wanted tonight to be about partnership," I began, letting my voice carry without strain, "about trust, integrity, and the kind of alignment that makes growth possible." My wife smiled at me, a practiced public smile, and Victor nodded approvingly as if I were praising him. The room quieted, attentive but relaxed, and for a split second I felt the weight of what I was about to do press against my ribs. This wasn't rage. This was deliberate. "Before we move into another year," I continued, meeting the client's eyes briefly, "I believe everyone who has invested time, money, and trust into this company deserves transparency." The word transparency landed heavier than the others, and I saw Victor's expression flicker, just slightly, as if a draft had moved through the room. My wife turned her head toward me, confusion flashing across her face, and I could feel the tension radiating off her body. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly, not into the microphone but close enough that I heard the strain beneath the calm. Instead of answering her directly, I connected my laptop to the screen I had rented for the evening, under the excuse of playing a slideshow of our anniversary memories. The first image that appeared was not a photo of us on vacation or cutting cake at our wedding. It was a clean, organized summary of financial transfers, highlighted in yellow, with dates and amounts clearly labeled. Gasps rippled softly through the room, the kind of sound people make when something unexpected pierces the surface of celebration. "Over the past 18 months," I said steadily, "certain transactions have occurred that do not align with the fiduciary responsibilities outlined in the partnership agreement." Victor stepped forward immediately, his voice sharp but still attempting control. "This isn't the time or place for internal accounting discussions," he said, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. We can review this in the office." "It is exactly the time," I replied, my tone unwavering, "because renewal meetings depend on trust, and trust depends on clarity." As he opened his mouth to argue again, several phones in the room buzzed almost simultaneously, a carefully timed chorus. I watched the board members glance down at their screens, watched the client's expression shift from polite interest to focused concern as the emails I had scheduled earlier arrived with attached documentation. Evidence. Transaction trails. Cross-referenced accounts. The room grew very quiet. Victor's confidence cracked first. "You're going to regret this," he said through clenched teeth, his composure slipping in a way that made the entire performance crumble. And in that moment he looked less like a visionary partner and more like a man cornered by his own paper trail. My wife stood frozen beside him, eyes moving rapidly between the screen and the phones lighting up around the room, and I couldn't tell whether she felt exposed, betrayed, or relieved that the fire had finally been named. The client cleared his throat, his voice measured but firm. "If these documents are accurate," he said, looking directly at Victor, "we will need immediate clarification before any further commitments are made." One of the board members nodded, already scrolling through attachments, and the hum of celebration that had filled the room only minutes earlier had been replaced by the quiet tension of people recalculating alliances. I didn't mention the affair. I didn't need to. The financial breach was enough to fracture everything he had built his image upon. I stood there calmly, while conversations shifted from laughter to legal language, from champagne to compliance, and I realized that control doesn't require shouting. It requires timing. Victor took a step closer to me, lowering his voice but unable to hide the venom in it. "You have no idea what you've started," he said, and I met his stare without blinking because I knew exactly what I had started. What I didn't know yet was whether she would fall with him or pivot fast enough to survive. The room never recovered its warmth after that night, and neither did the company. By Monday morning, the board had initiated a formal internal investigation. Accounts were temporarily frozen pending review, and Victor's once effortless charm had been replaced by a defensive sharpness that bled into every email he sent. There were no police at the door, no dramatic handcuffs, just something quieter and more devastating. Scrutiny. Investors began asking questions they should have asked months ago. The major client postponed the renewal meeting until further clarification. And the whispers started, first inside the company, then outside it, because reputations travel faster than press releases. Victor unraveled faster than I expected. In meetings, he grew impatient, accusing others of overreacting, insisting the discrepancies were routine reallocations taken out of context. But context is everything when numbers don't line up, and the documentation I had released was too clean, too organized to dismiss as misunderstanding. Within a week, his access to certain accounts was restricted by the board itself. Within 2, the silent investors had retained independent auditors. Watching it unfold felt surreal, like witnessing a building collapse in slow motion after noticing the cracks long before anyone else. Then the second twist surfaced, and it didn't come from him or from the board. It came from her best friend. We met again in the same cafe parking lot, but this time she didn't look terrified. She looked resolved, almost tired of carrying something alone. "There's something you need to understand," she said before I even closed the car door, her hands steady on the wheel. I braced myself for another layer. "I didn't send you that video just to help you," she continued, meeting my eyes directly. "I had already reported him months ago through an anonymous compliance channel." The words landed slowly, rearranging my perception of the last few weeks. She explained that after he approached her with that side venture proposal, she had dug into public filings and internal inconsistencies on her own, and when she realized the scale of what he might be doing, she filed a formal concern with documentation attached. "You used me," I said, not angrily but clearly, and she didn't flinch. "I needed leverage," she replied evenly, "and I knew that if you saw the personal side of it, you would dig into the financial side whether you wanted to or not." There was no apology in her tone, only practicality. She had calculated that I would become the accelerant to a process she had already set in motion. I always suspected she would choose survival over loyalty, she added quietly, and that sentence lingered longer than the rest. She was right. When the investigation intensified, my wife pivoted with a precision that almost impressed me. She cooperated fully with the board, providing access to emails, acknowledging that she had relied too heavily on Victor's financial oversight, framing herself as misled rather than complicit. She didn't mention the affair at first, but secrets rot under pressure, and eventually fragments of that story began circulating as well. Not from me, from people who had noticed patterns, from staff who had seen late-night meetings turn into something else. In an attempt to protect the company, she distanced herself publicly from him, and when investors began discussing potential civil action, she positioned herself as a cooperating partner rather than a co-conspirator. In exchange, she retained partial ownership on paper, but it didn't save the business. The major client withdrew, citing integrity concerns. Smaller partners followed. The brand that had once been built on trust now carried the faint but permanent stain of internal betrayal. Revenue plummeted. Staff resigned quietly, not wanting their resumes tied to controversy. And when the affair became part of the narrative during legal reviews, her reputation in the industry shifted almost overnight from rising star to cautionary tale. Victor faced the brunt of it. Investors filed suit to recover misallocated funds. His name appeared in trade publications attached to phrases like fiduciary breach and governance failure. He called her repeatedly during that period, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading, but she stopped answering after a while, choosing distance over drama, exactly as her friend had predicted. The night it all settled into something final. She came home later than usual and stood in the doorway of the living room watching me for a long moment before speaking. There was no anger in her posture now, no defensive polish, just exhaustion. "I know you knew from the beginning," she said quietly, and the air between us felt heavier than any argument we could have had. "I know you knew from the beginning," she said, and the way her voice landed in the room made it sound less like an accusation and more like someone finally admitting the weather had changed hours ago. I didn't deny it. I didn't apologize. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and saw how smaller she seemed without the armor of confidence, how the lightness she used to carry had been replaced by something worn and brittle. She took a step forward as if she expected a fight, and when I didn't give her one, she seemed almost unsettled, like she had rehearsed anger and I was handing her silence instead. "How long?" she asked, swallowing hard. "How long have you been watching me?" I could have answered with dates, with that 6:17 a.m. timestamp burned into my brain, but I didn't want to give her the comfort of a clean timeline. "Long enough to understand what you thought I was," I said quietly, "and long enough to realize you underestimated me." Her eyes flickered, and in that flicker I saw guilt, but I also saw calculation still trying to survive, because even now she was searching for the angle that would hurt least. "You don't understand," she began, her voice rising slightly. "I didn't plan for it to become what it became, and Victor—" And I cut in gently, not with rage but with certainty, because certainty is heavier than shouting. "You thought I wouldn't look," I said, steady as stone. "You thought I wouldn't wait, and that was your mistake." The divorce didn't start with a dramatic scene. It started with paperwork, quiet meetings, a conference room with neutral carpet and a pitcher of water no one touched. My attorney laid out the evidence of altered allocations, the dates of account shifts, the chain of custody for the documentation that had triggered the investigation, and the legal framing that mattered most, that her actions, combined with the ethical clause violations tied to the affair and the breach of fiduciary duty, gave me a strong position to protect my assets and limit exposure. Nothing illegal, nothing vindictive on paper, just consequences arranged in a way that made the truth unavoidable. When she sat across from me for the first mediation session, she looked like someone watching a version of herself being dismantled in slow motion. She tried once to soften me with nostalgia, leaning forward and saying, "We built a life together, and you can't tell me none of that meant anything." And the old part of me did ache for a moment, because attraction and memory don't disappear just because loyalty does. but I held her gaze and said, "It meant enough for me to give you every chance to stop." And the silence that followed was heavier than any insult. She didn't fight the settlement the way I expected. She was too exhausted, too publicly bruised, too aware that the world was already judging her harder than I ever could. The company investigation had turned into investor lawsuits against Victor, and even though she had cooperated to protect herself, the industry didn't care about nuance. People heard affair, financial scandal, internal breach, and they stopped returning calls. Friends who used to crowd our dining room for celebrations suddenly had reasons to be busy. The social circle that had once been built on admiration now avoided eye contact, because no one wants to stand too close to a burning reputation. She lost the business in the only way that truly matters. She lost the future she had pictured herself owning. Victor lost his career, not in a cinematic explosion, but in a quiet collapse, investor pressure squeezing him from every side until he became a name people mentioned as a warning. When he tried to contact me once, leaving a voicemail that started with forced confidence and ended with bitterness, I didn't delete it because I wanted the reminder that men like him always assume they can rewrite consequences with bravado, right up until paperwork disagrees. The best friend disappeared from our lives almost completely after it was over. She didn't gloat, didn't demand credit, didn't ask for gratitude. She had used me as leverage, and she had been honest about it. And in a strange way, that honesty felt cleaner than anything else I had lived through. She sent one final message that simply said, "I hope you get your peace." And then she was gone, stepping out of the mess like someone who had done what she had to do and didn't want to inhale any more smoke. On the night the final documents were signed, my wife stood in the doorway of the house one last time with a small box of personal items in her arms, and her eyes lingered on me as if she wanted to say something that would undo the last year. "Do you hate me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, and I felt the strange calm of a man who had already moved past hatred, because hatred ties you to the person who betrayed you. "I don't need to hate you," I replied, and my voice didn't shake, "because I didn't destroy you." She flinched slightly. "You did." She stared at me for a long moment, then nodded once as if she finally understood that the story she had been telling herself was over, and she walked out without another word. Sometimes revenge isn't about exposing the affair. It's about exposing the rot behind it. She sent me a video and said I deserved to know, and she was right, because I didn't just deserve to know, I deserved to win.